I went back to the critique of judgment now because we were having this conversation, and obviously there's quite a lot of things you can start with. But one thing I wanted to hear your opinion on is, of course, I think that whole book is highly problematic. You might have other ideas, but I think the fundamental problem here is that he's talking about a pure judgment. Am I quoting correctly? Well, it says pure, but I don't know if he's saying objective. He talks about subjective, objectivity, and these things that are typical Kantian way of speaking, right? But I think the major problem for a painter like me is that he's saying that to reach an objective judgment, you have to take away all your personal sort of memories or whatever adheres to you, personal memories, personal experience, whatever, things that are of this world, so to speak. And I tend to visualize Kant's ideal as, if your personal wishes and desires and all these things are your limbs, he just says cut off all the limbs, and then all the people who judge something, in fine art in this case, are the same. And he's saying that that's why this is an objective judgment. You take away all things that are related to you personally, and you reach a pure judgment, because if I do that, I'm not tainted by anything at all. I'm just objective. And then that's why I can demand, as he says, that all others agree with me. And to me, that's like hubris 3.0 or whatever. I don't know what you want to call it. But how do you see that? Coming as a modernist, is that something you relate to, or do you see a problem with that? Because of course, well, I want to hear your opinion first, and I can elaborate on why I think it's problematic.
Yeah, of course, Kant is highly challenging to read. That's the first thing while preparing for this conversation.
Come on, say it is a bad writer. That's challenging to read.
Yeah. So the thing with aesthetic judgment in the critique of judgment is that they aren't objective per se, as you talked about. I think in the part which is called the analytic of the beautiful, where he tries to detail how and what aesthetic judgments are, he contrasts the pure aesthetic judgment from objective judgment in that case that, for instance, moral judgments, ethical judgments are objective insofar as something is either moral or it's not. But with the aesthetic judgment, that's kind of interesting because as far as I know, and I'm not an expert, but I think the third critique is a kind of bridge between the theoretical epistemological philosophy of the critique of pure reason and also the practical application, the moral philosophy in a critique of second critique. So the aesthetic judgment has 4 moments or aspects, I think perhaps is a better word, which, if I remember correct, are quality, quantity, relation, and modality. And you can talk about bad writing; they're kind of hard to understand. But I think so. The kernel of your point, I think, is the one regarding quality, that aesthetic judgments have to be pure or disinterested. And of course, this is a term that has evoked a lot of conversation. And of course, the second point, I think at least, of quantity is this kind of universal dimension. So how can a judgment be both highly 100% subjective, but still claim some assent to the objective or the universal? So I think this leads us down to his third point of relation, where he, in his own way, talks about this idea of something being purposive without purpose. I think in German he says Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck or something like that. So it's an end in itself, and that's a phrase that we know from the previous critiques as well. Something like a moral act being or a person being an end in themselves when you're treating other people instead of a means to just something. So this Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck makes it so that an aesthetic judgment is a judgment of feeling. It's not a cognitive judgment or an objective judgment in the sense of morality. So how can a feeling judgment have this universal aspect? That is, he says that when I, for instance, look upon a sunset or a flower, and I say, this flower is beautiful. And the disinterested part here is that I don't, in this case at least, I don't want to bring the flower home. I don't want to smell it for the pleasure, because that's interest. But there's something in the form, the form of natural objects, and in some cases art as well, that has this, it looks like it's made from a purpose, like there's like this teleological reality behind it, intelligent design or something. Yet you can't really pinpoint any particular purpose or use it for any particular thing. So when I say this flower is beautiful, I say it, I almost claim that everyone else should be in agreement with me. And of course, here's the kind of tricky part, because of course there will be a lot of people who do not find this particular flower beautiful. But when Kant is writing his third critique, he is like Aristotle. He was like writing about a lot of the things that we see around us out there. Kant kind of does the same thing, but he tries to make an internal map about our cognitive faculties, so to speak. So he writes about all the different forms of judgments and how we can know things, and using reason in itself to test the limits of reason. So I think his point is that when I claim something from 100% subjective aesthetic feeling, if it's disinterested and if it relates to the form of the object or phenomenon, because he thinks the form itself is objective, the feeling judgment is subjective. So if all humans have the capacity, by way of being enlightened with reason and these cognitive faculties, this aesthetic judgment is possible for all, even though they might not befall my particular judgment in this case, I think.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, you do a really good job relating Kant's bad writing. Because there is a huge problem here. I mean, this is sort of him objectively trying to describe how the human mind works, so to speak. That's like the idea. And I encountered in talking to people saying how when I'm talking about how Kant has utterly destroyed classical culture, they say, oh, but he wasn't concerned with art. He was just concerned with how the mind views things in general. But he is surprisingly specific about it. I mean, to really focus in on where he does mention painting, sculpture, architecture, and these things, the fine arts, or what is at that time became seen as the fine arts. It has this. The problem is then, and I'm thinking also always as a painter, of course. If you have a nude which is beautifully painted, and you stop seeing that as a painting, but you start seeing that as a woman or a man, and you're somehow sexually aroused by it, that's where it says, no, don't go there. Yeah. I mean, this indifference, it's quite a long time since I looked at it, but he talks about an idea of indifference that I can understand. And popularly recapitulated, it's if you look at, well, for example, if you look at Caravaggio, his paintings are wonderful. Then you get to know that he killed a man, and then suddenly you don't like his paintings anymore. Now that is mixing two different things, right? Yeah. That is. So you should be in that sense indifferent. Just look at the quality of the work. Yeah. But then you come to Kant's idea, which is that if you look at a painting by Caravaggio and you are aroused or just overwhelmed by the drama, by the passion, by the violence, by the sensuality of it, and you say, I like this painting because of that, that's when it's a barbaric judgment, as he says. And I think, and this is also, I didn't mention this book to you earlier, but this is about Kant. I can really recommend reading this too. Kant, Art and Art History, about how Kant influenced art, not only through the Judgement, but through his general writing. It's a phenomenal book. But Mark Cheetham, in that book, clearly lays out the case of how there's a clear line from Kant's critical judgment to Kitsch criticism. This idea of Kitsch trying to lure you, trick you through the sensuality, through drama, through intensity. Yeah.
With Greenberg, for instance.
Yes, and he says that outright, that Greenberg's, Kant's barbarism, his view of what the barbaric judgment is Greenberg's Kitsch. And I think that's the problem then, that you can look at it sort of from a disinterested point of view. Kant is just describing how the mind works. But then you look at the implications of it, and for my field it has been catastrophical, obviously. But and it's in his general way of thinking too, where he is so concerned with sort of being philosophical and compartmentalizing things that he loses the organic totality of it. I mean, like for example, when he talks about, and that's a big problem too, he is concerned with purity all through. For example, when he talks about painting, and he says, well, when it comes to painting, the drawing is the main thing. The color is what sort of comes around and makes the drawing clearer, the form clearer. And it just struck me that this is a man who is sitting there saying that paint, the actual oil paint or watercolor, whatever, has nothing to do with painting. And I think this is what we're striving with in a lot of fields today, that he manages to go in, take one field and say, no, it's the opposite of what it is. As if there hadn't been any Rembrandt or Titian prior to him. I don't know what he knew, but I mean there were plentiful of prints around that you could, and he would have to know some of the names at least. And I think that's the problem then, that he writes from a perspective where he thinks that if you have no interest in it, meaning in my mind you have no knowledge about it, that's when you can arrive at a pure judgment or a pure evaluation of it.
I think maybe one reason that Kant has evoked such discussion is perhaps the idea of purity and disinterestedness in themselves has so many associations or connotations with them. I think the reason Kant I can't say the word.
Compartmentalizes.
Yes, thank you. He needs to establish this aesthetic judgment to create this bridge. With that said, I think, of course, he is notorious for valuing, I guess, floral drawings, designs, contours, and has a kind of limited scope of what he's saying about art. You're correct about that, and I think that just follows logically from his philosophical system, and of course from an artistic, organic perspective, from that kind of totality, that kind of phenomenological world you engage in as a painter. That, of course, that is. It can even be perhaps a bit rude when you stumble upon those things.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about what strikes me is that what happens with, I mean, the Critique of Judgement is sort of the book that all later aestheticians react to somehow. I mean, that's like the what you call the foundational stone there for the fine art term. And what I mean, the big problem here is that, you know, you mentioned Aristotle, and I continuously hear this as, you know, comparison between Kant and Aristotle, that they somehow were working in the same team or whatever. But I can only see them as complete opposites, like all down the middle, because what Aristotle is talking about, which is the basis, which became revitalized in 1540s with the new translations of the Poetics, and created a much greater drama. Titian was very concerned with this, reading the Poetics and trying to understand the basics of storytelling so that the paintings could be even more dramatic.
Yeah.
And what Kant does is all the time to try to unwrap that or undo that, right? And I think, I mean, one thing is to say that, you know, what's the term that Aristotle uses? You know, when you're aroused, and pity and fear, and he more or less uses those exact terms. I don't know if that is coincidental or not, but it's clearly relating to that whole tradition where, you know, to create drama you need, you know, pity and fear, because you need to identify with what is happening there.
Yeah.
And you know, when you look at, and this shows how he does not know what painting is or what that discipline implies, because, you know, if you look at late Titian, what he does is to start to dissolve the form, but very controlled, of course. He doesn't use color to illustrate,
no.
clarify the line, right? So Kant works completely against that all the time, and it surprises me. You know, Roger Scruton was so concerned with Kant, and to me that is a very strange thing, that you're working for a specific discipline that has to do with storytelling, and then you side with Kant. That is so strange. Yeah. But I mean, what was your reaction when you've been looking at the Critique of Judgments? I mean, can you recognize values that you base yourself on, or that you were taught in the academy or whatever? Yeah,
to some extent, I think so. I guess especially the part about the harmonious free play, which is a central point in Kant between our understanding and our imagination. And as far as I understand Kant, understanding is in a way cognitive, so it relates to different concepts and words and things that we know. It presupposes some sort of purpose, while our imagination in many ways is free. So when we are contemplating beauty, we are, and of course that's a Kantian point, we aren't contemplating the object in itself as such. We are contemplating, in a sense, a cognitive emergent phenomenon that arises with our faculties meeting this object or whatever. And if I was going to say, well, yeah, this is a glass, it's a beautiful glass or cup, but I first and foremost judge this through the concept of it being good or agreeable in the sense of craft. Does this relate to, does it work well? Does it leak? Of course, it wouldn't be a good glass or cup if the water fell out. So here it has a clear cognitive purpose, but the contemplation of beauty in itself doesn't go that far. But what happens instead is that the understanding and imagination engage in self-magnifying sort of feedback loop where these cognitive faculties excite each other, and which kind of just opens up this contemplative space where a beautiful work or the concept of beauty cannot be fixed to any specific concept or purpose in itself, but the mere activity, the mere feeling of the aesthetic judgment is, of course, again, the Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck. It feels and seems to be, for all intents and purposes, purposeful without it having a purpose like this, to be a vessel, for instance. So that's interesting in the case that it opens up a lot of new possibilities for experience and for trials and errors and bringing new sensations to the table of reality, so to speak. But of course, when we're talking about kitsch painting, I think perhaps Kant would regard such paintings both as beautiful, but also through the agreeable and the good, because of course storytelling needs some sort of concept. It needs to fulfill some activity that is also outside the work in itself, but exists in a context. So if you want to, like Aristotle, for instance, you want in the tragic drama, you want to create catharsis in the public, and of course you have to do this through different ways of employing harmony, rhythm, plot, character, and where I think Kant and Aristotle are the most similar is where Aristotle regards form or the plot as the most important thing, the primary thing. And this kind of echoes Kant's ideas. But of course, Aristotle has a lot more dimensions. For instance, I think his sixth dimension is spectacle. And this, for Kant, would be the pleasure, the interest, the charm, and the sensuous kind of...
Well, that's where he goes totally anal, Kant, when it starts talking about color. And that if you see a color, a pure color, then it's beautiful, and or it appears as beautiful, as he says. And that mixed colors don't have that advantage. And that's where you start thinking, what the hell is going on in his mind? Was like he's discriminating against mixed colors? What the hell is going on there? What's the point here? And of course, this thing about pity and fear is not the exact term that Kant uses, but that is where Aristotle and Kant, really go in opposite directions. And I think it's not a question of you and I agreeing or disagreeing that Kant is bad, whatever. I mean, I have my opinion on it. But when you understand that difference, speaking of our last conversation of kitsch and art, if you know this foundational document, so to speak, you have the poetics, you have the critical judgment, you sort of get guides to where you're going. It's when you start to mix these things and think that Kant could be a guide for a kitsch painter. And that's where it goes wrong, right? Yeah,
and I think a huge part of that is I don't necessarily know if Kant can teach us anything about making art as such, because it's already a kind of implication in his theory that he's most concerned with paving the way for this philosophical idea of the aesthetic judgment, and he wants to make aesthetics a sort of science. That's also why he needs the aesthetic judgment to be both subjective and universal, because disinterested pleasure in beauty couldn't exist, according to him, in that sense, without it being a purely subjective feeling judgment. But of course, aesthetics could never be a critical science with objective parameters, without it having some sort of universal value. So I think, and of course, I I think you have perhaps some issues too with the notion of the genius and
Don't
originality. Oh, I will.
Thank you for checking out this clip from the Cave of Apelles. If you want to watch the entire segment, head over to caveofapelles.com/donate and become a $5 patron. That will allow you to access all our Dark Flame episodes, bonus material with our featured guests, and more.